F. Scott Fitzgerald's career often gets boiled down to The Great Gatsby, and while that is certainly a novel deserving of its reputation, it was his first novel, This Side of Paradise, that launched him into the mainstream. He quickly became a perceived authority on the younger generation and flappers, and his peak of mainstream popularity was over by the time The Great Gatsby was released to disappointing sales. Fitzgerald was one of the most prominent members of the Lost Generation, and the specific perspective of this generation is reflected in his writing. This Side of Paradise contains many autobiographical elements. The main character, Amory Blaine, was born in the same year as Fitzgerald, was also raised in a middle-class family, both men were encouraged by Catholic priests, and both went to Princeton and pursued writing there as a hobby, and both men struggled intensely with relationships with women. And there are plenty of other things in the novel taken directly from Fitzgerald's life. This Side of Paradise was an instant mainstream success. It featured the romps of Amory in a fashionable college and his love affairs with flappers, which proved to be very popular with college students. And it should be noted that many of these college students had not seen action in World War I and were able to enjoy the post-war time without those psychological scars. But this group was also often the target of accusations of hedonism and immorality by the older generation. College became especially fashionable in the 1920s. It certainly had a respectable reputation before, but with college enrollment increasing and youth culture being so popular in the 1920s, colleges became a hotspot of youth activities that spread around the US. And while the college days of This Side of Paradise take place before World War I, it can also give a glimpse into college culture of the 1920s, though it was not exactly the same. Fitzgerald had begun This Side of Paradise under a different title, The Romantic Egoist, while in the military, though he never actually went overseas and never experienced combat. But he worked furiously finishing the novel because at the time he had a strange premonition that he would soon be shipped off to his death in Europe. While he might have lacked that often defining feature of the lost generation, traumatic war experiences, Fitzgerald still had to witness his generation's loss of innocence and youth, as many of his peers weren't so lucky to be spared a violent death in war. And he certainly had his personal demons too. This Side of Paradise was Fitzgerald's very first novel, so we can't expect it to be perfect, and it went through multiple drafts before it was finally accepted, with reservations, for publication. Though, as Maxwell Perkins at Scribner's recognized, there was certainly a lot of promise to this young writer. Fitzgerald was able to stick in some smart phrases here and there, and my favorite example of this kind of style comes near the beginning, when an invitation to a bobbing party in Emery's pocket, quote, had an intense physical affair with a dusty piece of peanut brittle. And some of the quick back-and-forth dialogue kind of reminds me of those screwball comedies from the 1930s. But anyway, I'm getting a bit sidetracked, so with that background out of the way, let's go through a summary of the book. Emery's father became rich by age 30 after the death of two brothers. He married Beatrice, Emery's mother, who had agreed to marry him, quote, almost entirely because she was a little bit weary, a little bit sad. Previously, Beatrice had had a relationship with another man, but then decided to marry for background instead. This distraught young man then entered the Catholic Church and became Monsignor Darcy. Beatrice indulged Amory, believing he and herself to be fragile and delicate, and raised him on poetry in a very sheltered environment. As an adolescent, Amory thinks himself better than the other boys and is a show-off. When he enters his first romance with a girl named Myra St. Clair, he tries to project a bad boy image, telling her that he smokes a lot and went to a burlesque. Amory and Myra share an intimate moment once and kiss. When Myra tells him to kiss her again, he says he doesn't want to, and Myra becomes angry and says that she hates him. Amory goes to Minneapolis for school, then his mother begrudgingly agrees to send him away to prep school, and she chooses St. Regis because her old flame, Monsignor Darcy, lives near there, and she thinks that he and Amory could get along. All the while, Amory continues to be an egotist. It is said of Amory, it was always the becoming he dreamed of, never the being. Despite seeming so confident in himself, Amory is not popular with the other students at St. Regis. When one of his teachers gently tries to tell him this fact, Amory, already knowing he was unpopular, gets upset and leaves the room. For university, Amory wants to go to Princeton, and he is the only one from St. Regis who goes there, which gives him an opportunity to reinvent himself again. His goal in college is to become one of the gods of the class. The most obvious route seems to be football, so he tries that, but he quickly gets injured and has to find a different way. He also considers some fraternities and organizations, but eventually decides on writing for a school literary journal, the Princetonian. He also finds opportunities with girls, but in these modern times, that didn't necessarily mean a relationship. We see Emery at a petting party, where he is very upfront with one girl about his expectation that they will never see each other again after that night. At one point in these college years, one of Emery's friends declares himself a Marxian socialist, though it's pretty clear that he doesn't quite know what that means. This kind of thing happens at other times as well, with some of the intellectual boys latching on to some new trend of political identity. Emery and his group of friends pull some less than admirable stunts, like paying less than half of a restaurant bill and collecting charity money to spend on booze and casually stealing bicycles. Then one night, a group of the boys, though not including Emery, were in a car. The driver, a boy named Dick Humbird, was drunk and ended up crashing the car, killing himself and injuring the others. Midway through his Princeton days, Emery has his second important romance, this time with a girl named Isabel. Like his first one, it is short-lived. Emery is attracted to her, but finds that he doesn't have any affection for her. But he still wants to kiss her in order to conquer her for his own vanity. They have a falling out. She accuses him of constantly being critical about her, which is true, but you could also say that Isabel is not entirely innocent of blame. She throws a fit when Emery holds her too closely and one of the studs on his shirt makes a mark on her neck. The mark won't go away, and Isabel gets very worried that people will see it and find out about her intimacy with Emery. Not having much tact, Emery quotes a poem and laughs at how silly the situation is. This time is the peak of Emery's vanity, and Isabel says that she doesn't like him talking about himself so much anymore. What had appeared to be self-confidence had turned out to be arrogance. They both think it's time to separate, and they do. Back at Princeton, Emery is disqualified from staying on at the Princetonian because he failed a makeup test for a class he had previously failed. He blames it on bum luck, but his friend Alec corrects him by saying that it was his system that had failed. Emery hadn't studied for the test and wasn't prepared despite knowing what was on the line. Now with no upward social mobility in sight, Emery thinks he's basically back at square one. At this critical moment in his development, Emery visits Monsignor Darcy, who writes him a letter after their meeting. He tells Emery that he is unsentimental, almost incapable of affection, astute without being cunning, and vain without being proud. Then Emery has a very bizarre experience. While hitting the town in New York City with a friend named Fred Sloan and some girls, everyone but Emery gets very drunk. At a cafe, Emery sees a strange middle-aged man looking at his group, though the others are unaware of him. The four of them go to one of the girls' apartments, where Emery sees the same creepy man wearing pointed medieval period shoes. Emery calls everyone's attention to what he's seeing, but they not only don't see it, they think Emery is just having a drunken delusion. Emery thinks the man is the devil and is terrified of him. He escapes from the other three of his acquaintances and feels that he's being pursued by the devil man. At one point in an alley, he calls out, "I want someone stupid. Oh, send me someone stupid." The next day, he talks with his friend Tom at his room back in Princeton, and Tom says he thinks he saw someone looking at Emery. Not long after that strange experience, Emery learns from Monsignor Darcy about his widowed third cousin, Carol, living in Philadelphia. He goes to see her and is surprised at how vibrant and cheerful she is despite being poor. This becomes the next important relationship in his life. Unlike the previous two, which were marred by immaturity and shallowness by both parties, Carol is not spoiled and seems like a decent person. One day, Emery makes a half-hearted marriage proposal, but she declines. America enters the European War, and many Princeton students enlist in one branch of the military or another. But Emery's friend, Byrne, declares himself a pacifist, packs up his things, and goes back to his home in Pennsylvania. Despite having grown close with Byrne in recent months, and Byrne being an important part of his personal development, they disagree on this topic, and they go their separate ways. Byrne's decision also contrasts with that of his brother, Carey, who had previously enlisted in the illustrious Lafayette Escadrille. Previously, Emery had not been very interested in the war when it broke out a few years before, and while he still isn't especially passionate about the war when he enlists, he is worried that his friend Byrne will ruin his good reputation by running away from the war. Byrne is highly idealistic, though not a German sympathizer by any means. Emery follows the vast majority of the others by joining the war effort. Any hint of idealism in Emery before had been hollow and fake, as it was with many of the other superficial people he had associated with. The next section consists of only a few pages and covers the period of May 1917 through February 1919, Emery's entire experience in the war. The fact that this part is so brief is something I'll touch on a bit later. We find out in this section that Monsignor Darcy sees Emery as his own son, and that Emery's mother, Beatrice, died while he was a soldier. He is annoyed that she left half her money to the Catholic Church, and that the street railway stocks that Emery inherited were losing value. We get a summary of Emery's thoughts through a letter he sent to Tom. He says the war has made him a passionate agnostic, and that he's restless as the devil, and has a horror of getting fat or falling in love and growing domestic. Emery then meets Rosalind, the younger sister of his friend, Alec. Rosalind is presented as quite liberated. She openly declares that she has kissed many boys and intends to kiss more. She and Emery begin a passionate relationship, with both expressing love for each other. But Rosalind's mother doesn't approve of their relationship, and she tells Rosalind that Emery will never amount to anything respectable. Despite the fact that Emery gets a job at an advertising agency just so he can satisfy Rosalind, she wants to have a more comfortable and leisurely life, which she could never do on Emery's salary. She says that she will not be the same person that Emery loves now if she is forced to live without a lot of money. Emery makes $35 a week, between $500 and $600 today, but her standards are simply too high, and for her, that makes the relationship impossible to maintain. Unlike with Carol, Emery is truly in love with Rosalind, so her rejection of his marriage proposal is absolutely crushing. This breakup really unravels Emery, and he goes on a reckless drunken binge for 3 weeks, which was only stopped with the beginning of Prohibition in January 1920. During this spree, he was back with shallow, materialistic, and nameless party people, and the narration explains that the people and surroundings that he remembered as being cool or delicately artificial seemed to promise him a refuge. During this period, he didn't show up to work for days, and when he finally did, it was only to quit. After all, he had only gotten that job for Rosalind, so there was nothing keeping him there. While on a trip in Maryland, Emery meets Eleanor. They have a rather sedate relationship, not passionate like it had been with Rosalind. Emery never proposes marriage like he had in his last 2 relationships, and his love for Eleanor begins to fade. In order to prove a decidedly small point about herself while on a horse riding outing, Eleanor recklessly tries to run her horse off a cliff, killing the horse but sparing her, and they ride back together on another horse. Eleanor is wild, but Emery has mellowed since his crushing relationship failure with Rosalind. The narration reads, "All the way back she talked haltingly about herself, and Emery's love waned slowly with the moon. Emery had loved himself in Eleanor, so now what he hated was only a mirror." They had both had a premonition that their relationship wouldn't last, so this isn't really surprising. Emery then goes to Atlantic City and happens to meet Alec, his college friend and Rosalind's brother. After falling asleep in Alec's hotel room, he wakes up to house detectives knocking on the door, trying to bust unmarried men and women together in a room, which would have been a violation of the Mann Act at the time. Emery decides to take the blame, instructing Alec to act like he's in a drunken sleep. If Alec had been caught, it would have caused damage to his family, which included Rosalind. Emery has pretty much nothing to lose that he hasn't already lost, so he figures it's a better trade. His plan works, but the only consequence is that his name is put in the newspaper telling of his crime. Right next to this blurb, he sees the engagement announcement of Rosalind and her wealthy fiancé. This dashes, once and for all, any lingering hope Emery had of winning her back. The very next day, he learns that his family's money is pretty much all gone, and that Monsignor Darcy has died. Later, Emery is walking aimlessly around when 2 older men in a car ask if he wants a ride, and he accepts. They have a long political and philosophical discussion, mostly with disagreement between Emery and the men. Emery argues for socialism, though also says he hasn't really thought about it too deeply before talking with the men. The men associate socialism with the Bolshevists, who they really don't like. One of the men gets very angry and frustrated by Emery's ideas. The other man turns out to be the father of one of Emery's friends from Princeton who had died in the war. With this reveal, they all leave each other's company on fairly good terms. In the final section of the book, Emery reflects on himself, understanding and accepting himself, though recognizing things that might not be good, like his selfishness. The book ends on his final declaration: "I know myself, but that is all." Now onto the analysis section. But a quick disclaimer: literary criticism is not really one of my main things, so if that's what you're really into, I'm not sure how disappointing my analysis will be. I'll mostly just talk about a few themes in no particular order, and it definitely won't be comprehensive. First, let's review Emery's relationships, because they play such an important part in his development throughout the novel. The first one, with Myra, isn't especially interesting. They were both very young and they were both immature, though it seems like Myra was the one who overreacted more, much to Emery's confusion. With Isabel, it's similar, though Emery is more to blame here because he often criticized Isabel and looked into things about her that just weren't there. Clara is quite a step up. She's independent, intelligent, and self-assured. She also recognizes Emery's faults acutely and doesn't seem bothered by becoming poor due to her husband's recent death. When Emery becomes close to Clara, she eventually opens up about her evaluation of him. He is still rather immature and lacks true self-awareness, but after he prompts her, she reveals her analysis of him. This was all said in a two-way dialogue, but I reconstructed most of it into a monologue. Clara tells Emery, "You have tremendous vanity, but it'll amuse the people who notice its preponderance. You're really humble at heart. You sink to the third hell of depression when you think you've been slighted. In fact, you haven't much self-respect. The reason you have so little real self-confidence, even though you gravely announce to the occasional Philistine that you think you're a genius, is that you've attributed all sorts of atrocious faults to yourself and are trying to live up to them. For instance, you're always saying that you are a slave to highballs. You're a slave, a bound, helpless slave to one thing in the world, your imagination. I noticed that when you want to stay over an extra day from college, you go about it in a sure way. You never decide at first while the merits of going or staying are fairly clear in your mind. You let your imagination shinny on the side of your desires for a few hours, and then you decide. Naturally, your imagination, after a little freedom, thinks up a million reasons why you should stay, so your decision when it comes isn't true. It's biased. You lack judgment, the judgment to decide at once when you know your imagination will play you false given half a chance. Emery grants that at least some of this is true. Even though some of the criticisms were a bit harsh, Emery does eventually let them sink in, though in the moment his reaction was to offer up half-baked excuses. This did not ruin his relationship with Clara like it might have with a different woman before, a sign of his developing maturity. Clara is also religious, which recalls Emery's run-in with the Devil Man and the path correction of his life. This is in stark contrast to his group of college friends, whose lack of religious conviction we can probably assume. We can see more of Emery's developing maturity when the narration reveals what he thinks about Clara. She was the only girl he ever knew with whom he could understand how another man might be preferred. His ego had taken a few major blows, and he was finally able to accept that perhaps he was not the ultimate conqueror. Emery's experience with her reveals that he's a bit out of his league, and for once he seems to recognize that that's a possibility. His ego takes the hit, but it's probably for the better. Then, of course, there was Rosalind. Emery's relationship with her was the most important. He really truly loved her, and we can see him trying his best to satisfy her. He even gets a job he knows he won't like to do that, sacrificing his ideals in the process. But she just couldn't accept him if he wasn't well off financially. I think we can all agree that that wasn't entirely fair to Emery, especially considering that his job didn't pay that badly, and he probably could have secured a raise at some point, as his boss implied later on when Emery quit suddenly. Some people might not understand why Emery would continue to love someone who wouldn't marry him for such seemingly shallow reasons. I've personally been in a similar situation, so I can definitely say it's not as easy as it sounds. They had already developed their relationship and had grown close before the question of money was seriously brought up, and that sense of betrayal can be brutal. Fitzgerald had also been in the same situation. In fact, Rosalind is supposed to be based on his famous wife, Zelda. Then Emery's last relationship of the novel with Eleanor was not very intense. In theory, she seems to be the best match for Emery, but Emery is still in a vulnerable state emotionally and isn't ready to move on. The heartbreak he suffered at the hands of Rosalind still haunted him, and despite Eleanor's personality being very unique and the fact that she is definitely independent, she seems strikingly immature, at least to me. At this point in his life, that doesn't seem to be what Emery wants. They come off more as friends or companions than a potential couple. They left on good terms and even wrote to each other years later. It's a rather sobering end to Emery's experience with women. Now, let's take a little step back to the very beginning of the book. The title, This Side of Paradise, comes from a Rupert Brooke poem called Tiare Tahiti. Part of this poem is excerpted at the top of the first chapter, reading, "Well, this side of paradise, there's little comfort in the wise." Rupert Brooke was a dashing young British poet known for his youthful appearance. After enlisting in the British Army at the start of World War I, he became known as a war poet. Unfortunately, he died of illness while serving in Greece at the age of 27, making him forever young. Brooke was very popular among other young, mostly college-age poets, and his sudden death was an immense tragedy to that group, and he became a symbol of lost youth among the lost generation. While This Side of Paradise achieved mainstream popularity through its portrayal of modern youth culture, it also contains the influence of the lost generation mentality, Fitzgerald himself being very much a part of that. And while the lost generation is often portrayed as being haunted by the war, it wasn't necessarily grim first-hand war experiences that colored that mentality. For example, Fitzgerald himself, whose personal experience can be found throughout the novel, never saw any combat during the war despite being in the army, but he too still suffered from intense disillusionment and his own sort of demons. You could also argue that this isn't necessarily a generational thing and more of a universal one. Although it should also be noted that while Emery didn't see combat, he did have some friends who died in the war, and he occasionally thinks about them again later on, and that's certainly something that weighs on the mind. So he wasn't completely untouched by the war, but we don't have a clear idea of what Emery actually did when he was a soldier. Much later, it's mentioned in passing in the narrative that he was a bayonet instructor. And I think that the point of this vagueness is that it doesn't matter. The war provides a backdrop for the story, and its influence is correspondingly not front and center, but in the background, similar to how it might have felt to the younger Jazz Age generation. Before enlisting, Emery thinks about the war and blames it entirely on the previous generation, the Victorians, for dragging his own generation into the conflict on their behalf, and he denounces them in a poem. Emery certainly doesn't support the Germans and views its government negatively, as well as the people who support its war aims. But it's not his war, and he isn't especially enthusiastic or patriotic about his part in it, yet he joins anyway. Perhaps it's because a part of him still wants to feel accepted, to follow the group, even if that means possibly sacrificing himself in the process. Later on, when Emery is talking to Tom, he reveals what effect he thinks the war has had on him and others like him. He says, "I'm not sure the war itself had any great effect on either you or me, but it certainly ruined the old background, sort of killed individualism out of our generation." The whole idea of separating generations gets a bit tricky in this period. Those who participated in the war are generally seen as the lost generation, while those who were just a bit too young for the war are sometimes called the Jazz Age generation, which I mentioned a minute ago. The Jazz Age generation is sometimes lumped in with the Lost Generation, and also sometimes overlapping with the Greatest Generation. While those who fought in the war and those who missed it by a year or two are, I would argue, in the same generation, the war certainly put a noticeable wedge between them. And it's interesting to note that This Side of Paradise was especially popular among those who were just a bit too young to have participated in the war, and were in college when it was published in 1920. Since they were the ones who were a big part of the roaring side of the 1920s, it's an early look into this younger group and their development. Perhaps Fitzgerald could relate better to them, not having been especially affected by the war in a direct sense like many others around his age. He certainly engaged in a lot of the self-destructive and escapist activities many of the younger set did, though he was conflicted about it. Dick Humbird, a student with Emery at Princeton, represents the ideal of youth to Emery. He was described as the eternal example of what the upper class tries to be. So when he dies suddenly in a car accident, it's highly symbolic. He was also part of the emerging new money group, meaning that his family's wealth came very recently as opposed to being inherited over multiple generations. This new money trend was big in the 1920s, considering the greater opportunities to get rich that had recently emerged. I have a feeling that Dick Humbird was meant to be similar to Rupert Brooke, who at the time of his popularity was also considered an ideal of youth, and he remained as such to Fitzgerald's generation even after his death. Another character that I feel is symbolic is Carey Holiday, the brother of Bern Holiday. Like Dick Humbird, he's a fairly minor character. At Princeton, he was with Emery's rowdy group, and was there when they paid only about a quarter of a restaurant bill, and he was actually the one who explained the reason to Emery by saying, "You see, Emery, we're Marxian socialists. We don't believe in property, and we're putting it to the great test." It was also Carey's idea to collect money for French war orphans to actually use for booze. But he ended up joining the distinguished Lafayette Escadrille, which accepted American volunteer pilots. And the fact that Carey got involved in such a dignified unit might be surprising given his penchant for petty crime and rather weak morals. His brother Bern, on the other hand, was a rather serious person with a strong drive for achievement, and he seems like he might have been the type who would want to fight in the war for his principles. But when America enters the war, Bern declares himself a pacifist and refuses to fight on the grounds of his strong idealism. But dodging the war is something we might have expected Carey to do based on his character. We don't really get an update on Bern after he leaves, but we can assume he went on living back at his home in Pennsylvania, whereas Carey died in the war. Emery admired both of them for different reasons. Carey for being confident and carefree, Bern for being idealistic. I'm not really sure where I'm going with all of this, but it feels like there's a message in there somewhere, so I'll just leave it laid out like that for you to decide. Now I'll talk a little bit about what I thought were issues with the novel, but once again, literary criticism isn't my forte, so feel free to disagree with me. The first thing that comes to mind is that I felt like some of the commentary is a bit too vague. The biggest example, I think, is the Devilman episode. It comes up very suddenly and it's quite jarring, but only lasts a few pages. You can tell that there is some kind of message, but it's not easy to grasp, at least for me. I mean, we know that Emery is having an identity crisis and that he and his friends have engaged in some immoral things, so there's probably a connection with morals and the devil and about Emery straying off of a respectable path or something. But the Devilman appears when Emery is hanging around three others that aren't exactly doing anything morally wrong per se. They're drunk and a bit annoying and certainly don't have much substance to their personalities, but it's not like the stealing that was going on with Emery's college friends. So it seems like a strange time for a morality crisis to happen, though that could just be because I'm looking at it from a modern perspective, and our idea of what is immoral is different from what people back then thought. Unmarried couples drinking and partying together would definitely have seemed immoral to quite a few people in 1920. It would seem clearer if, instead of a Devilman, there was something representing Emery's more dire identity crisis, though I'm not sure what that would have been. His blind pursuit of status is kind of connected to his identity crisis, but it just didn't seem like a strong enough connection to me. And the other strange thing is that it's unclear if the whole experience was some kind of fantasy or hallucination. Emery wasn't drinking when he saw the Devilman, and this is weaker evidence, but later Tom says he thought something was watching Emery from a window, but that could have just been a mistake. Emery being so supposedly lucid and the image of the Devilman and the sounds of his footsteps seem to point to it being real, unless it was a frightening schizophrenic episode or something, but there's not really any other evidence to support that. And I'm not really sure what to think of it. Of course, I assume that it wasn't real and it was all in his head, but that's open to interpretation, I guess. I'm sure all of this has been dissected by others who have convincing arguments, but I generally approach these reviews with only the text and historical context because I don't want to just take other people's ideas and I don't want to be too academic anyway. My reviews are more for average people who casually enjoy this literature rather than those wanting to really dive deeply into theories. So with that perspective, I think this is a weakness of the novel. Fitzgerald did have ideas and did have commentary he wanted to say, but the articulation was sometimes too vague in this novel in my opinion. For someone in his early 20s, the commentary could be surprisingly mature, and this undoubtedly is a combination of much of the novel being taken directly from his own life and his acute ability to evaluate and understand those experiences. It seems to me like when it came to things he took directly from his own life, he can articulate them very well and with nuance. But when he inserted things as literary devices, like the Devilman, it's clunkier. But that's not proven, it's just my theory. I know that what was most criticized about This Side of Paradise when it was first published was the formatting, and by that I mean how each chapter consisted of smaller sections with their own titles. But this actually didn't bother me at all, and I think it's just because that kind of formatting isn't as drastically different now as it was in 1920. However, at the end of the novel, Emery has a long conversation with two older men, and despite it being one continuous conversation, it's divided up into a few sections, sort of breaking up the different themes of the conversation. It doesn't really detract from anything, but it also doesn't really add anything, so it's a bit of a strange stylistic choice. And since we're talking about formatting, I want to bring up another thing. One of the most interesting choices Fitzgerald made with this novel was, after the short interlude, he switches to a stage play script formatting, with stage directions and everything. It's a bit jarring, though not completely distracting. The dialogue is snappy and well written, but I just couldn't help but wonder why. What purpose does it serve? It was certainly an experimental technique, but I'm not so sure that it's warranted. What makes it even more confusing is that it stops, goes on for a few pages in standard narrative format, then goes back to the stage play format a bit more. And it's not like the situation changes all that much. Some of the short narrative sections still feature Amory and Rosalind having a conversation, much like in the stage play formatted scenes. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it just left me confused. Though I don't think I need to keep talking about it, so I'll leave that to everyone else in the comment section. I didn't dive deeply into the background of the book, but it might be that Fitzgerald had originally made this section as a separate piece, then inserted it into This Side of Paradise. But if that's the case, then it could have easily been reformatted to fit with the rest of the novel. And I have one more little bone to pick with this novel. I have a bit of a pet peeve when it comes to a certain detail that I've come across in this novel and others. It's really small and very specific, but I've seen it in multiple generations of books. Nearly every character is somehow well versed in classic literature, and they frequently quote things from old books and poems from memory. Yeah, I know it's a petty thing, but I'm gonna talk about it anyway. Especially in Emery's school days, there are sometimes just lists of authors, famous and obscure, whose books Emery read, and we're talking like 10 names with each list, and it happens a number of times. Then a bunch of characters write or say poems to each other, like more than a few times. It always seems so unrealistic when I read that kind of thing, and maybe it's just me, but it also seems unnecessary. It just seems like some writers don't understand that most average people don't constantly quote classic literature out loud to their friends. It's a small thing, so it's really not that important. I thought at first maybe Fitzgerald was using this to show how Amory and his friends were still immature in college by simply repeating the ideas of others rather than forming their own. But then it continued to happen even after they left college, though ever so slightly less often. By the end of the book, Amory completely renounces his belief in these writers and poets, though it's not so much maturity as it is disillusionment that compels him to do this. So overall, This Side of Paradise is pretty good, though I think it requires more attention from the reader than some of the other 1920s books I really enjoyed. So it might be a little bit of a stressful read for people who just want to relax. But I think if you like to really look into a text and think about it deeply, it won't disappoint. I don't think it's very controversial to say that it's definitely not as good as The Great Gatsby. But of course, this was Fitzgerald's first novel, and he was a younger, less experienced writer when he wrote it. So, to summarize my jumbled thoughts, Fitzgerald sometimes sets up a good commentary but doesn't quite drive it home, and many things are left vague and a bit disjointed. I wouldn't rate it nearly as high as An American Tragedy or Main Street, but I might put it in the lower middle tier. Well, anyway, I guess that's where I'll end this video. I was originally going to make it earlier, but my notes after the first reading were disappointingly short, so I ended up reading the book again months later and taking better notes. And I'm glad I did, because I feel like I could think about things much better the second time around. And I also realized that Amory's arc is kind of similar to mine, and I'm guessing some of you might feel the same way about your own arc. Not only can some of us connect to it personally, but it also gives us insight into Fitzgerald himself, considering so much of the story was very close to his own experiences. The sad thing, in retrospect, is that we now know that in the end, he was not able to reconcile with himself, and the optimistic ending of This Side of Paradise becomes less so knowing that. That is, if you thought it was an optimistic ending to begin with. So, yeah, if you weren't satisfied with my breakdown of F. Scott Fitzgerald's debut novel, I hope that this video at least inspires you to read it for yourself, or read it again, because that's still a win in my book. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.